what I like about Cyberpunk is that it feels transgressive. It questions a lot about like what it means to be human, about what it means to be a society, about like gender, and about all kinds of fun things. It really puts things through the ringer. And I wanted to have a story that looked at that really hard, that questioned about like what a functional society looked like and how you would try and live your life in one that's like slowly falling apart.
Award-winning author Robert Jackson Bennett joins John and Scoop in our virtual studio discussing his latest novel, Foundryside, his writing process, and much more. Join us as the Plutopia News Network continues our search for writers who matter.
So welcome everybody to the Plutopia podcast. I'm here with my partner in crime, Scoop, and our guest today is Robert Jackson Bennett. He's a two-time award winner of the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel. He's won an Edgar Award for Best Paperback Original, and he was a 2010 recipient of the Sidney J. Bounds Award for Best Newcomer and a Philip K. Dick Award for Citation of Excellence. City of Stairs was shortlisted for the Locus Award and the World Fantasy Award. City of Blades was a finalist for the 2015 World Fantasy, Locus, and British Fantasy Awards. The Divine Cities Trilogy was nominated for a Hugo for Best Series. And his eighth novel, Foundryside, has been released in just last year in 2018 and has got really wide acclaim and excellent reviews and a pretty great book. And I will just add that from all that I can gather, not having read all of these books, it appears that we're kind of on a fine line between genres here. And that's kind of one thing I wanted to ask you about, Robert, in just a minute. I do want to mention that Plutopia is on Twitter, @Plutopia. And we're also on Facebook, Plutopia News Network. You can find us there. And now we will move forward. And as I was saying, it seems like you are tying genres together quite a bit, or maybe just ignoring them.
I always think that I write fantasy, and then everyone tells me that I'm wrong. I guess that like the way that I come at it is I like to write worlds that have a fantasy feel, but have a different sort of structure to them. And this has been since 2014 when Stairs came out. The way that I think about all of the Divine Cities books is that they are like spy novels that are dressed up like fantasy. And like one reason why I wanted to do that was I wanted to look at problems and themes that were closer to what we are experiencing in the world today. And I thought that it'd be tricky to do that with a classic fantasy story with like beards and swords and magic and castles. Because one thing that seems to be really common in those stories is this idea that that's how the world has been for tens of thousands of years. Sometimes it's like 1,000 or 2,000 years, but at other times it's like literally 10 to 20,000 years. This is how the world's been. It hasn't really changed. It's been pretty static. And I don't think that that speaks to the human experience, but especially not now, when there's a huge amount of change ongoing. And so I think that if you want to have a story that has a statement that's about change, then you need to come at it from a different point of view that makes change the centerpiece. And I think that that's one reason why people sometimes don't think that it's fantasy, because that's a big trope in fantasy. That's not one that I pay much attention to. Like the Stairs books feel like they're in like 1900 to like 1915. They have like guns and cars and trains and things like that, but they're all old. They're not that advanced. Like phones are brand new by the end of the book. By the end of the series, I mean. And And for Foundryside, it feels like Venice, but it's acknowledged that the rate of change in that world has been incredibly rapid, and a lot of things have been upset in a handful of decades. So I think that because I focus on change and because I want to look at what change does to us and how it changes how we think about each other and the world, that kind of sometimes makes people think that it's not a straight fantasy novel. I think that it is straight fantasy. It's got swords and people get stabbed, and that's all that I really need.
It seems to me that scribing is sort of like writing code, right?
Yeah, that was the inspiration for it. I was driving. I get a lot of pretty good ideas when I'm bored, and I was driving. And I was thinking about Harry Potter and trying to think of a magic system. And a lot of people kept saying that they really liked the one in Harry Potter. And I like those books, but I'm like, that's not really a magic system because, like, they just point something and say word and the world changes. There's no real correlation as to what that means. Like, why did that happen? And also, it's really hard for me to figure out, like, how did they find out how to do that? Did they just point random things and say random words until something happened? Or, like, how do they test their way to get to that point? And so I was thinking about what magic is. And my conclusion was that magic was basically a list of instructions that you would have to give to the world to convince it to change. Because the world is dumb. It wants to keep on trying to do the things that it's been doing. So you have to create an argument of instructions that are very clear that can persuade it to do something new. And I was like, okay, so it's basically code. And so that once I thought of that and thought of a way to make magic like code, that opened up all kinds of fun doors about how to think about how this might work in this world.
Kind of like undermining vernacular reality with quantum physics, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it gets to, like, there are times that I have ideas and I'm like, I can't put this in there because though this could be possible, it would break the world. For example, I had to think really hard about ships and shipping. Because it takes a lot of work to do scribing. You have to have a big machine that's close by that can really convince the world to do something new. And so I had to think about how they would make that work long distance. And I came up with this idea of that they would make a really big ship that could power a whole, like, fleet of smaller ships. And that's how they would do shipping. But there was a lot of stuff where I was like, that sounds cool. And then I'd start to do something with it. And I'd be like, if I do this, it's going to ruin the entire book. It's just going to destroy the entire book if I nudge this bit of reality.
Yeah, right. If you don't have some rules, then it feels inauthentic.
Yeah. So the problem was that, like, this would follow the rules. It would just make a lot of, like, the rest of the book pointless. I was like, if they figure out how to do that, it disrupts everything. Like I would think to myself, there's no reason why they can't do this, except that plot-wise, it would be really inconvenient for me. So they're just not going to decide to do this, or they won't have this idea. And so that gets me into gets me both into and out of some weird jams. That's part of the fun of this series, is being like, well, how are they going to, like, think their way out of this? And then I have to think through like the solutions that they come up with, because I'm like, is this like too world breaking? Because if it is, then I got a real problem on my hands. This needs to feel like organic, but it can't, like, break the sky in half or something.
Did you have any concerns about the fact that you're referencing magic, getting complaints from people? Well, you're ripping off Harry Potter. You mentioned Harry Potter.
No, I think that the largest complaints I've had so far is that it's not like Harry Potter, and that, like, there's rules to the magic that are pretty strict, and I like to play with them and talk about how these guys have thought out ways to bend reality like pretzels. Because I think it's clever. It's like when you find, like, the way that someone, like, invents their way to something that has huge effects can sometimes feel like an accident, or it is an accident. It's just because someone happened to make this one thing that got super cheap, super fast, and then 20 years later it caused this to happen. That's fun to me. But for a lot of people, they were like, can you just like have magic words? And they do that, and then sometimes they kiss more. Could you do that? And I was like, yeah, I don't know if this book is for you.
I think the complaint that you're not like Harry Potter is a big plus. It would be in my mind anyway.
Well, I like that, but I'm not gonna tell my like marketing team to run with it.
I think the only complaint that I saw was somebody was complaining that the sort of mega corporations that you have in the novel, that the logic of how those were working wasn't clear enough or wasn't fleshed out enough, and that they were a little confused about it. But then they also noted that that's probably going to be addressed in future volumes.
Yeah, and like I think it's kind of interesting because they're at this like weird part in history where it's a little bit like Rome, in which they have expanded extremely quickly, and a lot of power has been centralized really rapidly, like among the rich and the like elites. And so there's a lot of things that they're still doing that don't really make sense. And basically, the only reason why the wheels haven't come off the bus, kind of, is just because of norms to a certain extent, where we don't do this because you're not allowed to do this. And so you start to see those norms break down in the next book, because of course at the end of Foundryside a lot of stuff gets broken. But yeah, I mean, like I had someone say like, this obviously couldn't last very long, and I'm like, well, guess what, it's not. I mean, I don't want to write about something that's like really like stable. So yeah, I mean, like so we're at a point in time in this world's history where there's too much stress on too many old parts, and things are beginning to all come apart, and so we get to watch and see what that's like.
To what extent were you influenced by cyberpunk fiction?
A lot.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, the way that I pitched it was actually that it was a cyberpunk story that was dressed up like fantasy, and the reason why I wanted to do that is that what I like about cyberpunk is that it feels transgressive. It questions a lot about like what it means to be human, about what it means to be a society, about like gender, and about all kinds of fun things. It really puts things through the ringer. And I wanted to have a story that looked at that really hard, that questioned about like what a functional society looked like and how you would try and live your life in one that's like slowly falling apart. And so each time that I feel like the book, I'm just done writing the sequel now. I actually wrote one version, didn't like it. I rewrote it because I found out, I was like, this feels more like a war story as opposed to a cyberpunk story, because it doesn't feel transgressive in the way that it needs to. It doesn't question things enough. And so that's always been sort of my guiding star, is at this point is that this story is meant to cross boundaries with technology in ways that most fantasy, I feel like, normally doesn't.
It's kind of interesting to create a kind of imagined technology, just sort of like spin it up in a fantasy context.
Yeah. And it's led me to ask questions about like, what is a technology? Because like we tend to think of it as phones and computers, but roads and like a bridge or a farm really is a technology in its own right. And so the way that I came at it was thinking that a technology is something that makes the world makes the world change into something that it was before. So a farm is a sort of magic that turns dirt into apples. You take some dirt, you take some water, and you take some air. You can make corn, apples, or potatoes. It just turns those things into food for you for a few days of life.
It reminds me, I always thought when somebody asked me what I do, I would just say, I transform energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. I do it all the time.
We can all do. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
So how do you feel about Arthur C. Clarke's famous comment, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic?
I think that that's true, but I think that when you think of it as technology, you can comprehend both the good and the bad. Because when we say technology, we get the grasp that it's a tool. And we know that tools can be used for good or they could be used for bad. Like a ship, a ship can bring food to like a country, or it can bring guns and soldiers. So when it's used, when it is depicted in a fashion where it's clear that it could be used either way, I think that that's closer to the human conception of technology, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I'm kind of interested in how you sort of got where you are. What led? I know that you were trained as a writer. I mean, that was what you studied. But how did you take the path that led you to write science fiction and fantasy?
I think part of it was just trying to stay curious. And if you don't feel curious in the worlds that you're creating, then that's not a great sign for me. So I try and read, like I tried to stop reading a lot of fiction recently because for one thing, it stopped being fun. Because I would sit down with something that was fiction and I would say and I would feel myself trying to strip it for parts, which is work. That's not fun. But if you read about the real world, then it can be work and fun. And if you read about like history, then you've learned something new that's real, that is like possibly a thing that you could use outside of fiction, but you could also strip that for parts too. So I've always tried to stay curious in that regard, but I would say that the first 3 or 4 books that I wrote, they were kind of all over the map. It was kind of literary, kind of horror, kind of fantasy, kind of science fiction. And it wasn't until I went to Stairs that that I kind of set my path on what I wanted to do. And as far as what made me want to choose to write something that was more distinctly fantasy, I'll be honest, it's because that makes more money. People want to read that more. And I was like, if I can find a way to have fun and do cool stuff and try and push boundaries and get more readers, cool, sign me up. So when I tried to write Stairs, I was like, I'm going to write what I felt was a pretty basic fantasy story that just happened to do the stuff that I like to do. And everyone, well, not everyone, but the thing that I kept on hearing was this is such a weird book. This is so unusual. I don't even know what this is. And I was like, it's fantasy. It's got gods and swords and stuff. And they were like, I felt like I tried to do something really normal and I screwed it up. So there you go.
Do you find that things like current affairs and current politics influences your writing in any way?
Probably. I think that when I wrote Stairs and all of the Cities Trilogy, I was thinking a lot about change and trauma and how we can move past those things, about how we can move past the sins of past eras and trying to question if that's even possible. Because the past 10 years has been a real push to look back at the past, both as on both the like left and the right, as a beacon of how things were good, and that can be to like about how we used to have husbands and wives and live in suburbs, and everyone knew their place, and no one like tried to break any rules or change like the names of what this or that was. And then on the left, there's this idea of the like working class and unions and old school New Deal politicians and things like that, and how we've lost that era. And I just saw a lot of folks trying to look back and a few trying to look forward. And I kind of wanted to wonder, because to me, I think that a lot of our history is invented. It's a thing that we view through the lens of our own present. And so my impression was that you had a lot of people sort of cherry picking the past as a blueprint for the future. And I wanted to have a story where you saw some folks try and do that and have it go extremely wrong. Because in the Cities trilogy, there were lots of gods once upon a time. They all like worked for this like one empire that was really mean and like brutal, because I thought to myself that if a country has a god, that's like having a nuclear weapon. What are you going to do? You have to do what they say if you don't have one of those things. And so like if they have all the nuclear weapons in the world, you're in trouble. And then of course, someone finds a way to kill gods. And when that happens, like all the things that the gods said were true are no longer true anymore. And that's a lot of things that made these like nations run. So whole cities like vanished, and whole like mountain ranges turned to dust, which is really bad. And so there's a group of people who are kind of like lost their whole civilization pretty much overnight, and are trying to like remember what that was like as a source of pride. And they're trying to ignore all the things that were bad about it. And I wanted to look and see about where that could lead you.
That sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah, my conclusion was that it doesn't lead you anywhere good. It's usually not that we're trying, personally speaking.
Your blog has an interesting piece that you wrote in which you compared President Obama to Fabius Maximus.
Yeah.
And could you explain that a little bit? Because I read it and it was a fascinating observation.
I think that I might have stolen that idea from Mike Duncan, possibly, who does the Revolutions podcast. I think he had a tweet about it. But I wanted to look a bit more at it because there are eras where the state of play changes for nations, and they have to face a new style of like engagement or warfare. And like when that happens, a nation looks at what happens is like either like a nation will lose, or they will find a way, or they'll find someone who knows how to play by this new state of rules. And so in Rome, what happened was they got invaded by Carthage, by Hannibal. And so they had, and they were losing terribly because the Romans were like hyper macho, and like that was what like made them really great, was that they were hyper organized, but super macho, and would just come at you until they were all dead or you were dead. And like Hannibal was quite smart and knew how to beat that sort of army. And so they lost like, I'm not sure quite how many times, 5-6 times. They lost a huge amount because they were like never trying to think about trying to fight a battle on the right terms. They were just going to fight a battle and win it because that's Romans, because like we're Roman. That's what we do. That's what that's like what we've done for hundreds of years. Let's not stop doing it now, because then that would mean that we're not Romans. But then they had Fabius Maximus, who came in and was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to evade and cede land to him and lead him around and starve him out and only fight like occasionally if all of the if like all the elements are on my side. And they hated him for that because that was not the Roman way of doing things. That was not the old way of doing things. They wanted to do things the old way. They didn't want to fight this new way where you only fought when all the like elements were in your favor. So they pulled him back. I'm shooting from the hip here, folks. They pulled him back and said, you're a loser. We don't like you. We hate how you did this. We're going to do this the Roman way. And that led to the Battle of Cannae, if I recall, where like Hannibal just wiped the Romans out. It was the worst defeat that Rome had ever had. And it haunted them for hundreds of years that like he had killed so many Romans so quickly, so efficiently. And so that had made it pretty clear that they had been pretty stupid to do this, to pull out this guy who had learned the rules of this new game and fought this new game. But the sin there had been that these people didn't realize that the game had changed. They wanted to do it the old way, and they had wound up looking really bad by trying to do that again. And so with Obama at the time, I had thought that Trump's like election was a repudiation of a style of leadership that was cautious and more delicate, and trying to be more thoughtful and trying to like balance all these like interests, both like inside the country and outside of the country in the globe. And I thought that was speaking to the new state of play in the world, and that Trump was the old style of the world. And now, I'll be honest, I'm not so sure, because now the world looks more now like Trump might have more of a handle on the state of play than we thought, because the world suddenly looks a lot more Trumpy than it looks more like Obama's work, which is very troubling for me, because you have all these nations that seem to be like abandoning the old style of conservatism to embrace like nationalism, which is frequently very self-harmful. So I guess my point is, I'm not sure that I quite believe what I wrote back then. But maybe the future will prove me wrong.
Well, I think that Trump represents he represents larger forces at play.
Yeah.
And he's more of a symptom than a cause, but that wasn't as accessible, as easy to see immediately after his election.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think that when he got elected, I thought that we were just trying to live in the past. And the more that I see what's going on and how he seems to be so like enabled by all these forces, both like in the country and abroad, the more I become convinced that he is definitely a symptom of something larger. Because you see this happening in England, in Poland, in lots of Europe, Turkey. This is widespread. And we've thrown a lot of shoes in the air, and we're all still waiting for the other one to drop.
Don't you think it's kind of a reaction to globalization, to the fact that we're sort of being crowded together on the planet, and the borders are starting to blur, and there's a resistance to that?
I think that a lot of it is that we were told that if we all globalized, then we would all win. That everybody would like win in a really big way. And then came the global recession, which made a handful of people win a whole lot, and a lot of people lose in a really big way. And we've been told in the past 30 years that like in the West, that that the purpose of states was not really to take care of their citizens as much it was to like enable like markets to do that for them, to help structure markets in ways that would help a lot of different people. That was the point of government from like 1980s on. And I think that we're seeing the limits of that, where when lots of the like economy feels so skewed, and there's a lot of ways to get into holes and not get out of them, and there's no help. We're seeing that it sure would be nice if we had some kind of program or policy to like help people live in cities. Like, it's really hard to get housing. It's really hard to get childcare. It's really hard to get healthcare. And there really doesn't seem to be a way to stop that right now.
Yeah, we could also try to revitalize, rural areas.
Yeah.
I think they sort of feel left in the dust.
Oh, totally.
And there's a lot of people out there, and they're really very upset.
Yeah, I think that probably one of the worst effects of the Great Recession was that if you wanted a job, you had to move to like 10, 12 cities. That was it. There were only 10 to 12 cities that had a lot of stuff going on. And so you had to go there if you wanted to get a good job. And you also had to have like a really great degree. If you didn't have like a master's in this or that, or like a PhD, it's going to be hard for you to make a good living. There was a thing that I saw posted where it was a meme. It was quickly a meme, but about how they were asking for a job where you had to have a master's and the pay was like $14 an hour, and it was like, why do you have to have a master's for this job? And I'm not sure what the solution is for that. It seems like the smart thing to do would be like a really big like infrastructure program that would put a lot of people back to work, that would boost a lot of the economy. That's what a lot of people seem to dream about. Everyone says they want it. It never seems to happen. There's also a like really interesting piece about how there's a lot of schools in these rural areas that don't do a lot of like research anymore. If we could like invest in those and build more of a like knowledge-based like sort of like economy in these places that don't have that really, that could really bring a lot of stimulus to these regions. But the odds of that happening again seem pretty slim to none.
What do you think about like the idea of the singularity and accelerating change and the societal impact of that?
I think that it was a really hot idea in the 90s and the aughts when technology just exploded so rapidly. And the sky seemed to be the limit. There was there's a podcast called Never Fail, where they talk to like people who are quite successful but have had other failures in the past, and they talk to a corporate consultant who is sort of like a psychologist who was a venture capitalist in the 90s. And the way he talks about how the 90s were, where they would invest like $1 million 1 week, and then like the next week it would be $500 million, and then it would get sold and they would keep stock, and then it'd be like $1 billion within the course of 3 to 4 months. About how that changed like his like worldview. I think that creates a lot of expectation. And I think since the Great Recession, and since we've seen the rise of a different sort of technology that might not be used for good, it's sort of put a damper on people's spirits. And I'm waiting because there's a lot of concerns and fear, like about AI, of course, about how it might be used. You can see how could be really frightening in China right now. But it seems to have put a bit of a damper in on people's spirits, just because I think that the impression is that if we do get AI that's really powerful, only the rich people are going to get to use them, and the only thing that they're going to do with this AI is keep themselves extremely rich. I don't know how true that is. The hope, of course, is that the costs come down. It's something that all people can use. But we also thought that social media would help bring us all together, and I don't think a lot of people believe that anymore.
I think it's kind of hard to generalize about AI because it's really not clear what it is. I mean, some people imagine that it's Robbie the robot, but I don't think it's ever going to be that. So when we talk about AI, it's really just about building technologies that simulate human intelligence to some extent. But exactly how that serves going forward, to me, is really pretty speculative.
Yeah, and AI depends upon data, and that seems to scare people more than anything these days, is what's happening to their own personal data, and where is it going, and what is it being used to create. And that, I think, is scaring a lot of people. The more they're hearing about the things that are being done by the various social media companies and tech companies with the sales and trading of data.
Yeah, and there are things that I think are really cool that could be great. Like there was a paper that came out recently where it was a word learning algorithm that just read the abstracts of all these papers about materials science, and it read like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these, and it started from nothing, and within a few days it had built the periodic table and had invented a bunch of stuff that had been invented, as well as stuff that hadn't been invented yet. That's really cool. So they don't know if these things are real yet, of course, but it had a lot of suggestions for materials that humans had not come up with. I think that's one of those things that you hear about AI, and it makes you excited for the future. But I think that the fears about tech and AI speak to a larger sense of helplessness that's happening right now that might not all have to do with tech. It could be just a larger sense of politics, about trying to find a better job, about housing. Could be a lot of stuff. But the sense that I get is that there's a lot of anxiety out there right now. And one place that I see it a lot is a lot of people keep on saying that we're about to have a recession. And we might. I mean, there's a lot of things that are saying that we might, or that we probably are. But there's also a lot of signs out there that things are perfectly fine and are actually pretty good. But a lot of people just assume that one's going to happen. I think not because they're looking at the fundamentals, but just because they think things are bad. We're all helpless. Of course, it's all going to fall apart. And I think that the same thing is happening with AI. Where they just assume that things are bad, all the bad guys are going to get this stuff, and it's all going to go really bad. And I don't know when that inflection point's going to come where we suddenly start to think that technology is pretty great again. I don't know. I hope soon.
I think a lot of the speculations that you're talking about, that people are having about recessions and so forth, sort of depends on what their media feeds are.
Yes.
And many of, we have this incredible velocity of information, and a lot of it is pretty cockeyed, it's crazy stuff. And it's hard to separate what's crazy from what's not crazy. And there's some people who aren't showing, actually, they don't even seem to be capable of separating, or of critical thinking, because we don't really teach people to do critical thinking.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned before we got on the call, you had mentioned something about the incredible number of cameras that are starting to exist in the world. And I think that's kind of an interesting development. And I had seen recently there was a British television series called Bodyguard. Did you happen to see that?
I didn't. I saw the ads for it, but I chose not to let that into my brain that day.
Well, so that's a series about a guy who's, he's a cop and he's a bodyguard for somebody who's in government. And, there's bad conspiracies and that sort of thing. I mean, it's kind of a typical political thriller in a sense, but so much of what is happening in that is happening through cameras.
Yep.
And in the UK, cameras are really pretty prolific. And all of the intelligence gathering and all of the perception of what's going on is based on feeds from various cameras that are placed around the city and in buildings and so forth, and also a manipulation of what those cameras appear to be seeing. And I think that's sort of an interesting development, that we have a sort of like a broad visual intelligence that's emerging. That is also, it can be gamed, Yeah.
I think that's completely true. And I think it's just because, like, the things that made me think about that were, you have all the doorbell cameras now.
Yeah.
So it's a potential that all houses, that all doors, like in the next 5 to 10 years, that they might all have eyes, which is weird to think about. But also, if you think that self-driving cars are a thing in the future, that's just a big ball of eyes that rolls around in the street and records everything. So if you're out the street, then it can see you. And cars have, like, my car has, it's got a camera in the front, I know. It's got one in the back, but it also has ones on the side now, where if I'm trying to back into a spot, it helps me see how close I am to from above. It's really cool. It's really handy. But I think it speaks to that sense of helplessness that a lot of people have, where you have no control over who's looking at you or how, or what they're going to do with the things that they're seeing, which is also, I think, why people suddenly don't like social media that much. Not suddenly, it's been going on for 5 or 10 years now, because they don't have control over who reads what they're writing or saying or doing, and then the things that they do with it. So it's the sense of, I guess, a sense of exposure that's new. We're not used to being watched while we sleep and being judged on it. And I think so far, all the judging that's been happening has been actually pretty mild. Because there was a guy who said on Twitter recently that we're pretty cool with the loss of our privacy, so long as it means that Google won't tell people what porn that we're looking at. But once it changes to the things that are in your data might hurt your credit rating, so that you can't buy a house or get a job, and you have no control over what was in that data, or what algorithm made that call about you. You start to feel once again pretty helpless. They had a piece on Planet Money about a Muslim boy who went back to China 2 years ago, and he had no idea why, but he got flagged as a criminal. It was an orange alert, it said. And so they had all of these cameras and tools that were set up to basically be like, you shouldn't leave your house. It's not a good idea. And he didn't know why he'd been flagged that way, or what to do about it, or how to even go back to the States. And I think that we aren't that extreme yet, but once people start to make more judgments with all the data that's out there, it could feel that way pretty quick. Upbeat stuff.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking we have we have definitely drifted from the world of fantasy into the world of reality.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like the thing that why I wrote uh, the thought that I had when I first came into Foundryside was that the magic of scribing is something that's extremely powerful, but you have to be really smart and pretty rich to use it. And the thing that it does is that it changes the world like around you. It can convince the world to do something that it wouldn't do normally, but you want it to do. And so that feeds into this idea of like, if you have enough money, then the world's your oyster. You can change like you can change the world like at a whim to be a lot more to your liking. And if you read like the folks who um, like Epstein, who just got arrested, who is extremely wealthy and somehow like avoided prison for years, it can sometimes feel like, you know, if you have enough money, you can change a reality as you know it.
It sounds like you pay close attention to what's going on in the world around you, and you obviously have incorporated some of that in your writing. Is there something that you've seen recently that you thought to yourself, you know, I should put that into a story, something that's happening currently?
Recently, not so much, because I've been trying to finish my second book, and so I've been trying to stay on task as far as that one goes. I mean, like, there's all kinds of cool ideas that I read about that I think, you know, how can I put this into my book? Because the thing that I like whenever I read about like about history or about how the world's changed is when it's something that you didn't mean to happen but has a huge effect. Like with iPhones, you know, there's all kinds of things that like phones have changed and done. But one of the things I don't think that a lot of people realize is that to make your iPhone work, it has to know which end is up and which end is down. So they put in a little a gyroscope that lives inside your phone so that it knows if you've turned it sideways or upright. So the fact that they had so many phones get so popular, that it meant that they had to make thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. So the cost of like making them got really low. And then someone said, well, what else could we do with these things? What's something that really needs to know what's up and what's down and what's moving with changing? And they realized that it would be planes and aircraft, which translated in like drones. So drones exist because the phone exists. It's not because, and it's not a straight line. It's the fact that someone had this cool idea has opened the door for a lot of other things. And so one thing that I read just now that I thought was really cool is so right now there's a huge amount of like natural gas that's being pumped out of Texas, and we're having to find a lot of ways to store it and transport it, and that's been happening for 10 to 15 years now. And one thing that they do with it is they freeze it. That's one way to condense it to a liquid, and then you can transport it pretty safely, safer than a lot of other ways. But that means that they had to make a huge amount of this technology to like make gas incredibly cold so that it's a liquid. And so someone said, well, what if you could like do this to just air and freeze air? Like, what could you do with that? And there was a piece on a company in England called High Wind. I can't recall it. I just tweeted about it. They have High View is what it was called. Have made battery for like wind and solar is like makes too much power, and you don't know like what to do with it. The thing that you could do is you could feed it into this like huge a freezer that would freeze air and make it liquid, and then you could put that in a tank. And then when you needed more power, you could let the liquid air warm a little bit, which makes it expand very rapidly, which you can then feed through a turbine, which can then make power. So it's a sort of a weird thing that no one, I think, really expected. And they say it's quite cheap. And there's like lots of battery stuff that always comes out. Like for a while there was one a week, and they were frequently nonsense. But for this one, I thought that's pretty cool. I don't think that could have like existed though if gas hadn't gotten so plentiful, and if we hadn't had to make something new to make this bit so cheap. So we might have like invented a cheap way to store energy cleanly, just because we had to bulk up so much on having to transport what is pretty much like already stored energy that's dirty. So it's a weird little thing, and that's always those like odd little twists where someone like will find a new use for a thought. Those are always things that I'm trying to capture in my books.
Accidental innovation.
Accidental innovation, absolutely. That's the name of the human species, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, we're about time to close. There was one other question I wanted to ask you, which is, what's the most surprising thing you've read in a review of your work?
Oh, let me think. There was some, like in my first novel, this guy wrote a nice review of it. And he said that he really liked the part with the city of zombies. This was this like small town out in the desert. And he was like, I love how all the townsfolk were zombies. And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? There's no zombies in my book. I have no idea and I still don't know what the hell that guy was talking about.
Well, you better write that book.
I got to write it now. I got to make this guy happy. I don't want him 10 years later, he's going to figure out, wait a minute. And then he's going to write a really bad review of my next book. He's going to come back at me. This guy lies.
Thanks for joining us.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And let's do this again.
Thank you for letting me talk so much.
Oh, yeah, it's been fun.
That's what we love to do, is we like to not just talk about the expected things. We like to learn the unexpected.
Oh, well, I'm frequently not expected, for better or worse.
You can learn more about Robert Jackson Bennett at robertjacksonbennett.com. His books are available from Penguin Random House Books, online or in your local bookstore. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney, and this is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.